Welcome to the Arise to Live podcast, episode 171. We are back on track with a great interview with D. Scott Smith, co-author of Freeze Inaction in the Face of a Business Crisis. There's a lively discussion about how to identify and prepare for risks using the author's Value Wheel tool. Let's dive in.
Welcome, everyone. We have a wonderful interview with D. Scott Smith. For you longtime listeners of Arise to Live, he is almost becoming a regular here. So once again, just thank you, Scott. And he has some very, very exciting news. There is a book coming out. He's a joint author called Freeze, and that's going to be the main topic. And hopefully he's not going to get too upset with me of drawing out too many of the details in it, because he wants you to buy it. He wants you to buy the book. So, but we'll just get into it. Let's see, for you new listeners, D. Scott Smith, we have been working together for how many years, Scott?
It's a number of years, Scott. It's great to be on the Rise to Live podcast. Great to hang out with you. Although we were living in the same community, we actually met down in Redwood City, California, the heart of Silicon Valley, when we were both coaching businesses through the Clean Tech Open, which is the world's largest clean technology business accelerators. And it was a lot of fun because we're down there in Redwood City, and hi, I'm Scott. Oh, I'm Scott. Nice to meet you. Yeah, I live in yeah. And what turns out we lived in the same place, and so not only did we meet there, but we also then started collaborating on different projects together, and all around supporting and encouraging businesses, coaching and consulting.
Wow, that brings back memories. Okay. But we could talk about the past, but we got to talk about the future here. Mm-hmm. So title of the book is Freeze, Inaction in the Face of a Business Crisis. Title called Freeze. It seems like, you would call it like, we're going to conquer or something like that. So how did you come up with the title?
It's really interesting. There's the pandemic is kind of just in everyone's brain. Right. So when that first happened, and we'll say the March of 2020 shutdown was really a trigger point, because some businesses woke up one morning in the middle of March and were told they were non-essential and that they couldn't do business.
That's pretty discouraging.
Yeah, exactly. That somebody determines that your source of income, the way that you support your family, is non-essential, and that you couldn't do business. And what I saw going through some notes was that some of the businesses, especially retail businesses, just put a sign up on their window that said, "We'll see you in 2 weeks." So it was as if this shutdown, this beginning of the pandemic, was really not the crisis that they were to experience later. They thought it was like a 2-week vacation. They were just going to take some time off.
Either denial or escaping.
Exactly. And so we saw that there was a threat to the business. You're determined to be non-essential. And then rather than taking action, they took no action. They just put a sign up in the window and shut down, and literally took time off. And, it's funny because social media is in a way really distills down thought. And as we were going through that pandemic, I saw several different, very clear themes in social media posts. And one of them was blame. People wanted to blame the government or someone because they did too much or they didn't do enough. And that's what led to the pandemic. There were other people that really took it as a vacation and turned completely to entertainment. And so all their posts were really, is this series worth binge watching on Netflix? Because I've watched everything else there is out there. And then there were other people who were posting about the opportunities that this was taking, that they were able to implement because of the crisis of the pandemic.
So two out of the three are bad responses,
correct.
Blaming or escapism. But so this gets back into the book, right? You're talking about not freezing, not going to the inactions phase, but actually take action for new opportunities. Is that right?
Exactly. So now we go into the neuroscience of what happened. And so when we have a threat to ourselves, to our family, to our business, it kicks in a part of our brain called the amygdala. And a lot of people will be familiar with this is the part of our brain that triggers fight or flight. And so in the research, if you look though, there's actually three things. And my wife will love this because it's an alliteration. It's fight, flight, or freeze.
So kind of like
And
a deer in the headlights.
exactly. And so this is where we came up with freeze, inaction in the face of business crisis, because it's not what we want to do, but it's a lot of what we saw happen.
Okay. Well, pandemics don't come around that often. What was it, about once 100 years or something? So how does this new book apply to, I guess, I don't know, normal, maybe not be the right word, but more common crises that come up?
It's interesting because it's not that the pandemic was something that we were trying to address. It's just that in a way, the whole COVID pandemic accelerated a lot of what was already happening. People were already working from home. People were already doing video conferencing. People were already doing hybrid or online events. But this just made it. This has accelerated it, right? Brought it into the present faster. Well, in the same way, it really brought attention to this freeze response to crisis. So I can look back over, say, the large crises such as the pandemic, the current economic situation that we have with supply chain issues, inflation, and some other things that are going on. We can go back to the Great Recession, 2007, 2008. We can look to the dot-com boom and bust. We can go back to the stagflation of the late 70s and into the 80s, where this is crazy. Think about this. 1981, car loan rates were 25%,
Oh, wow.
and mortgage rates were 13%. And we had double-digit unemployment as well as the inflation. So it was a crazy time, but fortunes were made during them. We can go back to the Great Depression. Fortunes were made. Businesses and farms were lost, but also fortunes were made. So what was that? Now those are big crises, but there's small crises that happen all the time on a local business as well, local basis. So it could be that you're a business and your lease does not get renewed. So now what do you do? And these are things that we've seen in small businesses where you lose a key employee or a key business partner, uh, where you lose a major customer. There could be regulatory changes that prevent you from operating your business. So how do you identify those and what do you do? Because uh, when we were looking at that social media, fight, flight, or freeze, fight was really the people that were blaming the government or other organizations. Flee, these are the people who just went back into all the entertainment. But then there was the people that actually did take action, right? That actually found the opportunities in the business. So not only were those that were prepared, were they able to save their business in either a large or localized crisis, but they also were able to expand their business and find new opportunities.
Okay, let me follow up on one, break down a little bit what you just said. So something happens, a lease got denied, and you can't go on. But you mentioned the word prepare and then opportunity in the same sentence. So to me, they're like two different things. But can you kind of expand? Because you tackle this in the book. This is a major theme in the book, all right?
Absolutely, yeah. And I'll just give you a very personal example, and that is, uh, I have a partner that we've done a lot of work with. We've done business together, digital marketing and so forth with clients. And when the pandemic came, when the shutdown happened, he had a client that made the most of its revenue from doing these mini trade shows on university campuses. So the risk to the business was that they wouldn't be able to do these shows. So he called and said, "Do I know anything about virtual trade shows?" Well, we took that as an opportunity, and we actually created a partnership where we did virtual trade shows for organizations and virtual fundraisers for nonprofit organizations. So we were able to find an opportunity in the midst of this crisis.
Wow.
And
So,
actually do business that we wouldn't have.
right. Okay. So the crisis was in the pandemic, no face-to-face meeting, the whole business model, right, of meeting mini conferences on universities, it's just out the door, closed down. But rather than blaming or trying to fight or fleeing with escapation, they're saying it's like, hey, there's something. What does this make happen? What can we do? And went to online virtual meetings, right? And I know you haven't mentioned this before, but we've talked privately, and I remember this actually did very well.
Yeah, it was really good. We actually, the shutdown was in March of 2020, and we jumped onto it right away and had our first signed contract before the end of April 2020.
Wow.
So the key is not just to find those risks to your business, but also be prepared to take advantage of the opportunities that are presented. And the best way is to understand your business. And so we wanted to look at a model where you were able to take a quick overview of your business, and there's really 4 areas that we look at. And from there, do what is very commonly known as a SWOT analysis. You look at your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And
Yeah,
so
for
strengths and weaknesses.
yeah.
Yeah,
So I'll just expand a little bit on the SWOT. That's that
exactly.
2x2 square that goes through, and there's a box for the strengths, there's a box for the weaknesses, there's a box for the opportunities, and there's a box on the threats. I'll probably do a podcast on the basics of it, but I know in the book, man, you take this to the whole next level. I mean, you really use this tool in a unique and special way.
What we wanted to do was people are familiar with SWOT. So strengths and weaknesses, those are the things that are internal to your organization. The opportunities and threats, those are things that are external. So some things we have control over, some things we don't have control over. But if we identify them, then we know where we can take action. Because again, when we're faced with a risk, with a threat to ourselves and to our business, we can either flight, fight, run, or freeze,
That's a tongue
right?
twister.
Or be prepared to take action. And so what we wanted to do was look at this model I call the value wheel. And there's 4 components to that. And that allows you to basically map your business onto one page. And now, based on that, you can apply the SWOT analysis to each of those areas. So you can identify what would be the potential risks to my business and what might be the potential opportunities.
Okay, so if I understand right, you have this value wheel with 4 key elements in it. And then you apply the tool, the SWOT analysis tool, for each one of those 4 elements to really gain insight into your own business.
Correct.
And from there, you can make good actions, good decisions, and I'll just say succeed where people wouldn't think that was possible.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's really where the application of the concepts come in. So in the book, we lay out the structure for this. So what's the need, and then what's the structure? And then we've created a course and resources that people can access so they can be able to apply this directly to their business. And it's not a huge, overwhelming process if you just take the small steps. and keep it up. That is, review it periodically. And then when those threats and risks come to your business, you're able to not only save your business, but you can also look to those opportunities to grow and expand your business.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so going back to what you talked about, this freeze to prepare to action. So this tool that's in the book, and you talked about, once you've gone through the tool and stuff, that's the preparation, and you keep it update. And then if something happens, whether it's an opportunity or something bad happened, a key employee left or something like that, you're already have a plan that you can pull off the shelf and then hit the road running when that happens. That's really cool.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we really like that when you know what your skills are, what your strengths are, but also where those weaknesses are, that if there's a particular threat that arises, or you can identify to what extent would this hurt my business, but also what would be the opportunity.
Do you have an example of a company that I don't know, either did this or didn't do this?
In the book, we talk about a camera company. So they were a local retail store that had been in existence for years, selling camera equipment and doing photo processing.
So this is the old, when you say photo processing, this is the old days where you had like film and you took it on the camera and then you took it out of the camera and you brought it someplace and then they developed and printed out the pictures. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah. These are the old canisters of film that you would load in, analog film, and drop it off. You might drop it off at the 1 hour place or an overnight place, depending on where you were getting prints or slides made. But yeah, you would have your camera and it would have 12 or 24 or 36 frames, and you would drop it off and get those developed. So this was their business. They sold the equipment and they did the photo processing for analog film. Now, then digital cameras started coming along. They actually were able to make the transition from analog to digital.
Well, that's good.
And although it cut into their processing business, they started selling printers and paper and supplies for photographers to be able to take those digital pictures and make physical versions of them.
Right, at home. And so they don't have to go to the store anymore. They just do it at home.
Exactly. But they'd buy the supplies from the store. So they were able to make a transition from the analog to digital, and from photo processing to providing printing equipment. And they also did take on the education part to teach people how to use the new digital equipment. So they did really
great.
good.
Sounds like a good transition for them.
Yeah. So they understood what their skill was in being able to do the education and be able to provide photographic equipment, including turning those images into something that could be displayed, right? So either processing them and printing them in the old days, or in the modern world of digital printing. But that's where they stopped. Unfortunately, they didn't make the transition when customers became more comfortable with buying expensive equipment online. So for those who remember the early days of the internet and e-commerce,
like Amazon,
people were concerned.
Yeah.
They were concerned about putting their credit card into their computer and hitting this submit button. Well, that changed over time. Instead of just buying a small dollar item, people were now buying large dollar equipment. They were buying thousands of dollars worth of camera equipment and having it sent to their home, and buying it online as opposed to going to the camera store would save hundreds of dollars. So unfortunately, what happened was people would go to the store, they would check out the different camera, the lenses, and so forth, and then they would go home and buy it online. Mm-hmm. So the store owner wasn't able to identify this risk and take opportunity to make a transition in his business. So his only response was to put a sign up in the window: that said, buy it where you try it. He was trying to shame his customers into spending hundreds of dollars more on this equipment just because he had it in stock. Now,
So he
there are
froze.
he froze. He did not take action, and he could have found ways to adapt to the online business world, to the people feeling comfortable with buying very expensive equipment and having it delivered to their home, but he didn't. Then he went out of business. So they were effective at making the transition from analog to digital, but not from brick and mortar to online sales.
Okay, for the listeners, you listeners out there, there's a really this is a really good story in it, because it wasn't like they buried their heads in the sand. They were doing a lot of right things, but the world kept changing. New technology was changing the way that customers bought things, but didn't continue to adapt. And so I think this is what we're getting into: is just because you make one transition is not a guarantee that the next crisis won't come, and the next crisis won't cause a lot of problems. And you still need to have the plan, still need to use the tools from the book to make sure that your business continues. So this is
Mhm.
good stuff.
Yeah. And another local example was two different restaurants. And one of them was a very successful restaurant, and their lease did not get renewed. So, and they were given about a 6 month notice that the owner said, we're not going to renew your lease. And they did not take any action. They simply closed their doors and went out of business, which was unfortunate. They had good clientele. They were a successful restaurant, but the location they deemed was just something they couldn't deal with, and they just shut down the business. Whereas another restaurant, they had created a food truck. So when they lost their location, they were able to continue to service their customers and have this mobile business until they were able to find a new location. And then they continued with the food truck.
All right. Well, I'm going to put you on the spot here, Scott. So a lot of listeners out there are kind of they're business owners who build things, whether they're in construction, building houses and condos and buildings, or they're in some type of manufacturing. Let's take one of your tools and then the SWOT for, let's say, a supplier. The supplier is bought out by another company, and then overnight they say, we're not selling you the materials anymore. So how would you approach this? Coming from the book, what would be some of the things that can be done to prepare, and some things for an opportunity?
Yeah. So if you haven't done any preparation and you just get that email that says a key component in your product or service is no longer available, it's really hard to respond at that moment. However, if you've taken the time and if you've used the value wheel, and again, there's four components in there. There's the value that you offer. So what is the product or service? What's the problem that you solve? And then we look at your customer and the different components there. And again, do the SWOT analysis to determine what the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats are. Then we have your business model. And the business model is how you make money. So do you sell services? Do you sell products? And then what does it cost you to make that revenue? So that's the financial model. And when you're talking about a key supplier, key component, that's really the delivery model. So how do you deliver your product or service? And it includes your key activities, the key suppliers, the key partners, and the key resources that you have. Now, if that critical component goes away and you've prepared for it, you say, oh, look, we're single sourced on this particular component for the product that we make money on. What happens? And that's a threat. That's a threat to your business. So you identify at first that you're single sourced on it. And what would you do if that went away? And so this is where the preparation comes in. So they send you an email and they say, yeah, we're no longer going to be selling this component to you. It's not a new threat. And
Yeah, you're not
ideally,
blindsided.
exactly. Ideally, you may have stockpiled some sort of resources while you can make a transition to a new supplier. or you've been developing another supplier or alternative. Every business is unique, and that's what's fun. And that's why I really recommend that if you're a business owner, large, small, whether you are a solo entrepreneur, whether you have employees, a few or a lot, make sure that you're working with key advisors who will help you step back and look at your business from that larger scale, because so many business owners get tied up in the tasks of the day.
Yeah, the day-to-day stuff.
Exactly. And haven't taken a step back into the strategic and really determine what are the opportunities and threats, where are our strengths, what are the weaknesses that we have, and create contingency plans for that. And again, it's opportunities. Let's say that you were a printer in the market, and you're printing shirts and signs and all these kinds of things, and you have a competitor in the market. That could be a threat, and it could also be an opportunity. So what if their business lease got not renewed? You might come in and buy them, and that could be a rescue for them and an opportunity for you. So these are ways that you look. Yeah. Exactly. But you're prepared for it because you just said, oh, well, what if they do this, or what if this happens? And now we're prepared.
Wow, there's been a lot here. We probably should wind down the interview. Oh man, I'm still processing. There's a lot of good stuff in this. The book is, Scott has teamed up with this Veronica Jeans.
So Veronica Jeans and I decided to write this book. So she has written a number of books, primarily on Shopify. But she has a pretty broad business experience herself, and has experienced the loss of businesses because of external threats and risks that happened. And so she has a very personal experience as to why you would want to do this. Now, I also have a process to write a book, to publish a book, online course, and webinar in 12 weeks or less. And Veronica's in that course. She's working on a book. And then through that, we decided to collaborate on this one because we saw a need, especially because as we were coming through the tail end of the pandemic, and yet going right into some large-scale economic impacts on a global basis.
Inflation,
we said, yes, we really wanted to give businesses a tool that we could get to them quickly. And this is why we wanted to get the book out in short order. And so we use this 12-week process.
So how do you, where can we find this book?
Yeah, so the book is on Amazon. So Freeze, Inaction in the Face of Business Crisis is available on Amazon. And then there's also the website, stopinaction.com. There we have resources, information, and a practical application for being able to take the concepts and apply them to your business so that you're prepared, whether that big crisis like a pandemic comes in or the small crisis comes in, the loss of a key employee, non-renewal of a lease, or so forth.
So definitely check out this book. There's a lot of good stuff. I've seen some behind the scenes of it. This is going to be a powerful impact book for a lot of people. Any final words before we sign off?
Scott, again, thank you for the opportunity to be here on the Arise to Live podcast, and always great to spend time with you. And I'm really grateful to be able to share this because businesses, large and small, and really we're focused on those small businesses. The large businesses, when the pandemics and the shutdowns come, they usually have the resources to be able to weather them out. But small businesses have the ability to make changes quickly and find those opportunities. That's what we really, really wanted to do, was to give businesses the tools to identify the threats and risks to their business and prepare to not only save their business, but to find the opportunities and grow and expand.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being on again. You're a wonderful guest. With that, we'll sign off.
All right. Thanks, Scott.